We are talking Totally Killer, a time-travelling slasher horror comedy starring Kiernan Shipka, who you may know from the Sabrina TV show. And this has been described as Back to the Future meets kind of a slasher movie, which I would agree with, but I'd also say it's very similar, certainly in tone, to Happy Death Day, although it's not a time loop movie. Essentially, it follows a young girl played by Shipka in 2023 who, through circumstance, ends up going back in time to 1987, and there she tries to stop a serial killer who killed 3 people back in the 80s and has killed her mother in kind of modern times. So she kind of tries to kind of use her knowledge of the future to try and figure out who this kind of killer was, at the same time kind of making friends with her now teenage mother, her father, and other people that she kind of knows in life, and shenanigans ensue. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So yeah, it very much feels like a kind of Happy Death Day style kind of horror comedy. You know, this high concept idea, fast paced, it's a lot of fun. Lots of kind of like 80s references within the kind of fish out of water comedy. Let's discuss what I think works in this film. It is very kind of like high paced, kind of quite kind of like high energy, and it is kind of a kind of fun, if not, it's not particularly like hilarious necessarily, but it's certainly an amusing horror comedy with that kind of fish out of water aesthetic. Obviously, someone from modern times kind of like being deterred, so to speak, by the kind of the 80s and in its ways and its non-PC kind of way people could have thought back then. At one point I thought it was going to go a little bit over the board with that, but you know, it doesn't go too much into it, thank God. So there is a kind of a fun kind of comedy element. The actual kind of idea here with a kind of a time-travelling you know, protagonist ultimately using their knowledge to try and stop a serial killer. You know, we've seen variations of this kind of thing before, but it was a fun concept. I think the cast are very likeable. The real kind of fun things for me were to see our kind of our protagonist, you know, making friends with kind of like her modern days friend's mother, who is now the kind of the same age, her own mother, her own father, and things like this, and their kind of relationships. And because you know, they're the kind of the people in the past are a little bit kind of like, she's a bit strange, but because she obviously knows what the relationships will be in later life, Shipka's character is very much kind of like wants to kind of like be in, you know, be near them all the time, and I quite like the kind of the way their relationships kind of developed, and it gave the movie a little bit of heart, I have to say. So I kind of quite like that, and you know, it's a fun, like I said, the kills are. They're modern feeling kills, you know, it's kind of like a modern kind of style slasher in many ways. Although it is set in the 80s, it feels more like a kind of a modern sort of slasher. I have to say the killer aesthetic, I don't know if I particularly kind of liked. It could have looked like it was wearing a Beavis and Butthead mask, to be honest, or Beavis specifically, and never changed the t-shirt, which seemed odd, but there you go. But yeah, there's some kind of like kills here. I was kind of hoping that some of these victims wouldn't get killed, actually, because I thought it would be quite interesting, and you kind of want them to kind of like succeed and things like that. So, you know, I had a connection to these kind of these characters, and I kind of quite like the performances. And as someone who was a teenager in the kind of the 80s, I kind of quite liked, obviously, that 80s aesthetic. I think they went a little bit overboard sometimes, but nonetheless, it is quite fun. And yes, there is a little bit of commentary about, you know, how times have changed, and some of it I feel was a little bit kind of like, come on, but some of it was quite fun, and there's even some kind of like references, for example, where, you know, young people these days are not quite as toughened up as maybe they were in the 80s and things, which I thought was, you know, so it kind of punches kind of both ways. It's not a particularly gory film, it's not a particularly kind of frightening film, and it's I think the comedy is you know, it's pleasant, it's kind of fine. It's never particularly kind of laugh out loud funny, but you know, I think it was okay. The real strength for me, as I say, was kind of the characters. There were some elements here that I thought were actually surprisingly good. Now, that the time travel conceit was a little kind of just in there, but there were a couple of things that I think, just little moments of dialogue that I thought were quite good. For example, basically her friend creates a time travel machine just because she can. And she says in a line of dialogue that she has to have the phone on working, her modern phone, because it needs a GPS, because otherwise it will need to kind of locate where she is. Now, a lot of things in time travel, it always bothers me, because obviously the Earth is on a rotation, so if you were to time travel and you were to stay in the same place, the planet's probably not going to be there when you reappear in time, which means you'll be kind of floating in space, because obviously the planet moves and you're going to be in the same place. So a lot of time travel conceits seem to forget this, but this one didn't. So I quite appreciate that. It was a small detail, but I quite liked it. And even we have a sequence where in the future, the kind of the 2023 scenes, there's a sequence where, actually, is it in the past? I can't remember now. But the basic where there's an assembly, and they were sort of saying about knife crime, and the best thing to do if someone, you know, brandishes a knife is to run away, which is good advice. There were a few kind of bits of dialogue here which I thought were quite good. But let's now transition to what doesn't work. I mean, I think the movie isn't concerned about really setting up how the kind of the time travel machine gets kind of made. It's just there, you know, someone makes it in their garage, you know, and it's someone, that's it, you know. You don't need to know any more than that. So it seems a little bit of a goofy idea that this student has just made a time machine just because, you know, it's a little bit silly. So there's that. Like I said, I think some of the kind of the points of difference here, where Shipka's character is kind of like rolling her eyes about how like racist people were in the 80s, or how sexist they were, and how people couldn't say things, you know, I can see maybe it being a little bit like, ugh, you know, but I don't think it overdoes it. It probably just about, you know, gets to the kind of the line for me. And, you know, so yeah, there's going to be differences. There's going to be fish out of water. But I can understand why some people might kind of think, oh, it's kind of like preaching a little bit. You know, there is that. But obviously there would be that kind of difference in kind of mentality. So I don't think it's unfair necessarily. But I think it borders on becoming a little bit preachy. The kind of some of the characters in the 80 segments, I don't know, seem a little bit cartoonish. I mean, they're kind of fun and they're likeable, and I wanted them all to live. You know, I was kind of bought into their kind of like their fun kind of like little group, but they do seem a little bit kind of like cartoon characters at times, and kind of not really kind of like real people who you can kind of, I mean, it's the vibe it's going for. It's going for this kind of fun, silly vibe. But yeah, there's times here where, you know, our main character seems quite smart and resourceful, but the kind of her contemporaries in the 80s, her parents, friends, and things like that, seem just a bunch of doofuses, you know, and it's just kind of like, well, you know, they seem a little cartoonish. And yeah, so, and the kind of the serial killer element with it, how it kind of relates to the time travel thing, I thought there could have been more done with that, but I'm not going to go too much into it because I don't want to spoil it for you. Overall, though, it's kind of a fun movie. I did enjoy this movie because it's kind of like light-hearted, it's kind of quite fast-paced, it's very modern feeling despite it being taking place in the 80s. But the 80s kind of aesthetic is fun to kind of revisit, especially if you were, you know, my age and you kind of lived through the 80s. Certainly it's a nice kind of trip down a memory lane, so to speak. So I probably would recommend this movie. In actual fact, I'll give it a 7 out of 10. Despite some kind of shortcomings I have with it, I actually kind of quite enjoyed it, and it was kind of a movie that had me engaged, and that level of engagement is why I'm giving this movie a 7 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I shall look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.